This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast's USA 250 series on making government work, my guest is Gabe Klein, an investor and advisor in a wide range of public and private transportation sector innovations. Gabe's going to describe how his work in transportation has helped fulfill the founding generation's goal of a government that would create a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. Gabe's over 3-decade career has included work as an executive, entrepreneur, and advisor in a variety of public and private transportation programs. His work has ranged from Chicago traffic and municipal bike programs to advancing vehicle electrification nationally at the U.S. Department of Transportation. And he was most recently the executive director at the U.S. Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. So, Gabe, your background is so rich and varied. Can you give our listeners an overview of your work as an executive investor and advisor in all these transportation projects? And as you talk, think about telling us, we're going to get to what you learned about how to make government effective, but as you're answering this one and thinking back over your career, was there an overarching lesson about the importance of effective government in all that experience?
Yes. And Herman, thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor. And, I would tell you that the most important thing to me is the customer. And, when I went into government, I'd been an entrepreneur like 2 or 3 times. I helped Robin Chase and then her subsequent CEO to scale Zipcar. So I'd really come out of the private sector. I'd been in the bike industry, and I noticed very quickly that working in like a VC-backed company versus running a large government agency. My first government agency I ran was the Washington, D.C. Department of Transportation. In some ways, wasn't that different. If you focus relentlessly on the customer, if you force what I call radical collaboration between public, private, the advocates, and the NGOs, it's not that much different. You have a mayor or a CEO. You have a board of directors, or you have a council member or a set of aldermen. And you have to sell ultimately what you want to do or what you want them to do. And it's a series of carrots and sticks. So you can tell people like at Zipcar, hey, we want you to get into this vehicle because it's going to, it's good for the environment. But if you tell them it's going to save you hundreds and hundreds of dollars a month, and it's going to make your life easier because you have access to lots of vehicles, it's the same thing as in a city saying, we're going to give you this high-powered municipal bike share program. It's going to lower your costs dramatically. It's going to be fun. It's going to be fun. Transportation can be fun. It's going to lower energy use, and it's going to make our city cleaner. If you sell it to them that way, they're like, oh, okay, so it's good for me and it's good for others and the planet. And so I think it's all about providing our customers and our constituents choices. And sometimes those choices are things they've never seen before, like the iPad when Apple put it out. Nobody had seen one.
Right.
Same thing with bike share in DC. Then it became a national model, right? And so that's what I like to do, is take these things that are sort of quirky alternatives and make them mainstream, regular ways of moving.
Okay. Now, Gabe, the purpose of this podcast is to highlight examples of when, where, how, and why government worked. And I'm still interested in that experience that you were describing of how, let's say, if you were at Zipcar, how government could be important to the success of Zipcar. But you suggested we start out by talking about the development of the ChargeX consortium, which was designed to improve the electric vehicle charging experience nationally. So in that case, and if you want to include your experience at Zipcar, but what was the problem what was the solution intended to address? How was the solution executed? And in that, how was government critical to its outcome? Because that's really the core of what we're trying to get at here, is the fact that government plays an important, irreplaceable role sometimes.
Absolutely. And look, the joint office was very much an experiment in government. It was the first time that the federal government had created an office to span multiple agencies, and it sprouted out of the bipartisan infrastructure law, where they said, look, we're asking departments of transportation across the country to fill in gaps and implement electric charging stations, and most of them don't even know the folks over at the state energy agency. And as an example, I mean, I had run three DOTs, or I'm sorry, two DOTs at that point, and advised lots of other DOTs, and we didn't know who the energy people were.
When you say DOT, you're talking about departments of transportation. You advised Washington D.C. and Chicago. I know. Which were you said three? Was that
Well, I actually ran those. So
no?
I was the head of the DC DOT under Mayor Adrian Fenty, and then I was the head of the Chicago DOT under Mayor Rahm Emanuel. But then I went on to found or co-found with some great partners a consultancy called Cityfy, and I advised uh, um, agency heads, mayors around the country, and
Oh,
even overseas. And energy was not a big part of the conversation. And so, you know, when I looked at this role at the joint office, where we in some ways had very little power, right? But we had a wide span of control, if that makes sense. And so we spanned the Department of Energy and Department of Transportation. So I reported up to the deputy secretaries of both agencies. But and we worked with EPA as well, and then we worked with the White House. Having said that, our job was really as a convener, and government, I think, has a very important role in convening. We don't tell the private sector what to do unless you're regulating them. But in this case, we looked at we were coming up with the minimum standards for EV charging for the NEVI program, the CFI program, so DC
wait,
fast
hold
charging.
on. NEVI and CFI. Let's make sure our listeners know what those are, because what the Charge X Consortium was about is addressing this wide variety of programs that were designed to support the private sector, right? And but
Right,
by
right.
and so NEVI was creating a national network of EV charging stations, and CFI, what was that?
Those were the charging and fueling infrastructure grants. So
Ah,
Uh, NEVI is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program. It was a $5 billion program, and it really was meant like in the grand scheme of like a $90 billion investment that needs to be made in EV charging across the U.S. It's a small number, but it's a gap filling number. So there's certain places where it doesn't pencil, if you will, to put a charging station in, or it's in a rural place where there's no substations, for instance. And so this money was meant to fill those gaps that the private sector wouldn't fill. And the same thing with the charging and fueling infrastructure grant program, where money could go directly to cities or states. And it was focused more on like level 2 charging, slower charging, and some fast charging. And so what we recognized when we were doing the minimum standards for these programs was that we had a real gap with where we wanted to be and where charging was in the US. Some of it was just due to the age of these sort of first and second generation chargers. You know, they have a useful life of, let's say, 5 to 10 years. Um, and so there were some issues with reliability just around age, but then there were also some really key issues around payment processing and the user interface. There were issues with the vehicles communicating as they should be consistently with the chargers, and there were other issues like diagnostic data sharing. But as an example, like that credit card swiper that you see on a lot of chargers, that was the number one reason chargers were failing. And so when
right.
we were doing the minimum standards, we said we're not putting the swiper on there, even though from an equity standpoint, you could argue that it's needed. But we said, no, 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 we'll still do something. We'll do tap to pay.
One of the
Now,
classic roles, yeah, I just want to say
yeah,
one of the classic roles of government is to fill in those gaps. The private sector can roll out chargers, but in order for a driver to be able to charge his or her car at a variety of chargers, there has to be an agreement about standards for the credit card
yes,
reader. And that's, that, and when I hear that example, and I've heard it many times, I always go back. The original role of electricity was to give people the opportunity to have their light at night, but there were places where it wasn't possible for the private sector to get to those people in a cost-effective way. So that's what government did all the way back in the 1930s, right? I mean, it's the same role the
yes.
government has so long filled, is to supplement what the private sector can do to make sure there's equality of opportunity.
Well, exactly. Is EV charging a privilege or a right? On the other side of the coin, I would say on the sort of causal side, like without the government, we wouldn't have silicon chips, we wouldn't have autonomous vehicles, from DARPA. Like there's so many things that we wouldn't have without
We
the
wouldn't.
R&D and the efforts of government. And so we power the private sector in many ways, and the private sector then powers us. And it's very much a symbiotic partnership. And so I felt like our job was to really collaborate and help. And where are the best experts in the country? They're at the national labs. And so we already had a lot of wonderful national lab people on our team. And so we basically said, well, let's bring three national labs to the table. Argonne National Lab, Idaho National Lab, and now I think it's called the National Laboratory of the Rockies. And let's have them work with, it ended up being over 100 companies to figure out how do we, and we set a time-based goal in 24 months, how do we dramatically improve the experience for the customer um, at existing chargers. And here's what we found. Excuse me. We found that we really impacted within 24 months, and we saw dramatic improvement. But even more importantly, as we're rolling out all the new chargers, not just the publicly funded ones, but the privately funded ones, the charging companies said, hey, like, we're not going to say this publicly, but we've redesigned our chargers around what we learned here. We had one particular very large company that said, we've now redesigned our chargers to be modular because we see these these fail points. And what we want to do is be able to just slip it out and slip a new module back in. We want to get our reliability to that 97% that you require. So it was a game changer, and I got to give a ton of credit to the joint office staff, the national labs, John, who ran it for us out of the Idaho National Lab, John Smart,
John Wagner.
John Smart actually.
Oh, okay.
And he is very smart. I always tease him. I'm like, I'm glad your name's not John Dumb because I wouldn't have had you do this job. But it was really this idea of radical collaboration. Put your
Right.
ego aside. We're here to be transparent, honest. We have a problem. It's like being an alcoholic. You got to admit you have a problem, then you can fix it. We had a problem. We had charging stations that were 68% reliability, not 97%. And that's how we work together and fix charging in America.
Okay. I want to move on to the next question, the next example that you suggested we talk about. But I do want to mention in passing that the examples of the way government fills gaps are just extraordinarily common. For instance, the oil industry needed government support in order to get its financial viability settled way back when. And there would not probably be efficient combined cycle natural gas turbines if the government research hadn't contributed to designing them. So it's not just recently or in one area of transportation even that this happens. But Gabe, let's move to the second example that you suggested, which was the development and implementation of bike share programs and electric bike share programs in cities all across the country. That's a completely different and at the same time very similar problem. So tell us, what was the problem? How was the solution executed? How was government critical to the deployment of bike share programs?
Yeah, yeah. Well, once again, I would say it's about radical collaboration and it's about selling a vision to people. And that was a lot of my job was to make the vision as big as it could be, sell it and get all the stakeholders, and I hate to use that term, but get all the stakeholders on board. But then there's a really big, amazing team of people that makes it happen. And I think that's important, right? Like if you build great teams in government or the private sector and you empower them and you give them a long rope that hopefully they don't hang themselves with. And if they do, you have their back and you tell them you have their back. And so the first big bike share program we did was in DC. Then we did Chicago. I also helped work on the New York program, City Bike, from the private side. But if you've ever been in DC, you've probably ridden on the red bikes or the blue bikes in Chicago, and they're everywhere. And now there's electric bikes. And so back then in like 2009, we were working on this, and we had this little program called Smart Bike. And people were like, oh, that program was a failure. And I'm like, it absolutely was not a failure because we got it basically for free from our advertising vendor. And it gave people a sense of like the art of the possible, right? But then we said, well, we want to do something much bigger, better. We want it to be solar powered. We want it to be modular, all of these things. And so we worked with our compatriots across the river in Arlington County who were also thinking about this, seeing our Smart Bike program. Um, and I went to Canada and I saw this great program called Bixie. And I came back and we just like went to work. Scott Kubley on my team and Leah and the whole bike team, Jim Sebastian, like everybody put their nose to the grindstone. And we worked regionally and we put together in record time a large scale bike share program. And we launched it at USDOT with the deputy secretary, my friend Polly Trottenberg, and Mayor Fenty, and it was a huge success. And I give Mayor Fenty a ton of credit because he recognized that nobody was going to know exactly what this thing was that we were launching, but it was innovative, and he wanted innovation. And he said to me, he said, can this be like the biggest and best program in the country? I said, absolutely. He said, can it be revenue positive to the city or cost neutral? And I said, I think so. And there's a real lesson here. First of all, in leadership from Mayor Fenty, and he was so good at saying, like, these are my key issues. Can you address these? But then also, we actually budgeted very fairly for the private sector to operate and maintain it. And so when you look at Capital Bike Share, it's actually one of the most expensive systems to operate per bike in the country. And you would think, oh, well, that's not good.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it is good. And I'll tell you why. It also throws off some of the highest revenue per bike in the country. And so you might ask yourself, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that it is basically cost neutral in the city. In some of the suburbs, it's not, but it doesn't cost a lot to operate compared to other types of transportation programs. There's no driver, right? It's bikes, it's solar powered. But the other thing is because we pay a fair amount, we get a great value. Because it's run well, more people use it, and that means that it makes more money. And I think that's something that sometimes we miss. Government wants the lowest price. Well, the lowest price isn't really what you want. You want the best value for your taxpayer, for your constituent. And so I think if I have a gift, it's building trust, this idea of radical collaboration and transparency. And once we get to that, you can build any program successfully.
I want to just add here, a lot of people who listen to the podcast know that before I was a journalist, I was a doctor of chiropractic. And one of the important things, not everybody wants to ride a bike to work. Not everybody wants to ride a bike to work every day. But having that opportunity can make a huge difference in a whole community's health. because it gives people an opportunity to break the cycle of numbly waking up and numbly riding a public transportation or numbly driving your car to work, to actually exercising healthfully, getting to work that way and getting home that way. It can make a world of difference in people's lives. The other interesting thing is I think you brought these programs to low income communities, which is
Yes.
something that, again, it's about filling the gap. Maybe people will put bikes in, I don't know, Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills, but maybe they won't put them in South Chicago or something.
Right.
And you're creating the opportunity for the other communities that don't have these advantages to have that same health benefit, right?
Oh, Herman, there's so many things you just said that are important, but in my book Startup City, I have a chapter devoted to bike share, and I talk about how we actually brought the bikes to South Chicago and the psychology of it, and not dropping them in on people, but more showing the success and then getting the alderman to ask for it, but having the money set aside to execute it. There's some very important nuances and lessons, but to your larger point, it's about social return. It's not just even about best value. It's about what is the fully loaded societal cost benefit of this thing that you're doing? And are you making people's lives better? Are you making them more interesting? Are you making them more fun? Are they seeing the city at human scale? Is the air cleaner? Are you making them safer by putting in protected bike lanes? So there's a whole wraparound to this, but I'm really infatuated with this idea of societal and social cost benefit and not just looking at the return in
Okay.
cash.
Gabe, we don't have much time left. It's been a great conversation already, but one last question, as succinctly as you possibly can, and it's an
Yeah.
open-ended question, but what are from your experience, what are the key levers of change that you saw in these programs that could expand our experience of how government can serve its citizens?
Yeah. Okay, you said be succinct because I could speak for hours on this.
Yeah.
But basically, it's can you provide an extremely positive experience for people or a program or product or project that will benefit them? Can you deliver it on time? Can you come in responsibly from a budget standpoint, under budget? Or can you make it so that it is cost neutral in the future by partnering with the private sector? So I'm really infatuated with this idea also of P4s. So it's like it's a public-private partnership, but it's for progress. You predict
Mm.
that progress, and then you measure the progress, and you take those things that you can't typically quantify, like wellness, like how people feel about their government and their city, and you actually quantify that. And that's something I'm working on now. And I think that when you're honest and transparent with people, you tell them what you're trying to do, and you show them the results on the streets, they react positively. And that's what I experience in all of these jobs.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. I just want to remind our listeners that the things you just described, they're ideals, but you are talking about them as things that you actually accomplished, that you saw enacted. You saw government doing the things that you say it needs to do to be effective. And I can't stress strongly enough how important it is to understand that you're not hearing pontification, but you're hearing what someone actually lived and did. Gabe, thanks very much for coming on and talking about your experience. My guest has been investor and advisor Gabe Klein, and he's described transportation projects that show how government can be an effective ally. I also want to thank my producer, Melissa Brown. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.